Okay, welcome everybody. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I think some people are still trickling in, but I do want to let everyone know that the webinar will be recorded and is usually posted to our YouTube account soon after, so hopefully this evening or tomorrow morning. So if you missed anything, you're more than welcome to rewind to the beginning, or if you want to double check something or see something again, it'll be available to you. So we're super excited to meet with you tonight. Thank you for spending a little bit of your evening with us. We are Med School Coach. We work with OnlineMedEd, and we provide tutoring services to medical students. Today we're going to be talking about high-quality resources for Step 2 CK. And we have two of our excellent tutors with us. My name is Joel Ramirez. I am our Director of USMLE Complex and Medical School Tutoring. We have Mackenzie with us, who's in the middle of your screen, or middle of the shared videos at least. She's a fourth-year medical student who also spent a year doing research and getting an advanced degree at Mount Sinai. And then we have Dr. Peter White, who is one of our master tutors and one of our more experienced tutors, and will be starting his residency in orthopedic surgery very soon. So we are super happy to have our tutors with us. Both are very experienced with Step 2 CK, worked with several students, and have performed extremely well on their own exams. So we're really excited to hear from them and kind of get some insight into what they think are high-quality resources for Step 2 CK. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to go ahead and start with a simple poll, just to get an idea of who is joining us. I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll now. Go ahead and select your answer. We'll get a good sense of who is attending our webinar. What year in medical school are you? Okay, we'll give you a few more seconds. I still see some votes coming in. Okay, so I think the majority of our attendees are third-year medical students, which makes complete sense because you are the folks that are thinking about Step 2 CK, as well as some fourth-year students. I know that Step 2 CK, there is a range of times where you could take the exam, and so you know, that's also a really important thing that we can talk about today. And also, just to let everyone know, there is a place where you can put questions. So if you submit questions to the GoToWebinar, they'll come up on our screen, and we'll either get to them while we're moving through the webinar if they're kind of quickly answered and related to what we're talking about. Otherwise, we'll have about 30 minutes at the end to do a question and answer session. And during this question and answer session, we'll focus on answering questions related to Step 2 CK, but we are happy to answer any questions related to the USMLE exams, resources, or study plans. I know that Mackenzie and Peter both have a lot of experience with all of that, so this is an excellent opportunity to learn from the best. So here's a little bit of an overview of our webinar. We'll talk a little bit about what Step 2 CK is. We'll talk a little bit about creating a study schedule, choosing and utilizing resources, and then common pitfalls in preparing for Step 2 CK. So we'll actually have Mackenzie and Peter cover the same topics, and it'll be interesting to see if they have the same ideas, or if these differ, or if they've worked with students who have consistently had the same things helpful work for them. So really quickly, Step 2 CK. Step 2 CK is a long exam. It's a bit longer than Step 1, so it's kind of depressing when you're taking the exam and you see everyone leaving the testing center and you realize you still have 1 hour left. So you'll be there when it opens and you'll be there when it closes. It's going to be 8 one-hour blocks plus an additional hour for break time, essentially 45 minutes and a 15-minute orientation. So it's a 9-hour exam. It's crazy long. And so the passing score is going to be a 209, and the scale is going to be similar to Step 1, except it's shifted to the right a bit. So the passing score for Step 1 is a 198. Passing score for Step 2 CK is going to be a 209. And it's the same with the percentiles. So a 230 on Step 1 is not equivalent to a 230 on Step 2 CK. Things are shifted up by about 5 to 10 points. So let's go ahead and do our next poll. How important do you think Step 2 CK is for residency selection? So everyone's talking about Step 1, and everyone knows how important Step 1 is, but is Step 2 CK important? What do we think? Is it important? Should we bother, or should we take a longer vacation? Give it just a few more seconds. If you haven't voted yet, go ahead and submit your vote. Okay. So I think the majority of people think it's really important. No one thinks it's not important at all, so that's definitely a great start. And I definitely would agree. I would say it is really important. I think it's going to be more important for others as well. And what I mean by that is Step 2 CK often can be a really great opportunity to make up for a Step 1 performance that you didn't think reflected your abilities. So if you took Step 1, you got a passing score, so you can't retake it, but it wasn't quite where you wanted it to be. Step 2 CK can be invaluable in demonstrating that you can perform well on these knowledge-based tests, and specifically because it's a clinical knowledge-based exam, that could actually be more applicable to residency. And so this could be very, very important for some students, but I think for everybody it's generally important. So this is some data that is from a survey of program directors across all specialties. So all program directors from all specialties were requested to fill out this survey, and it was asking about what they thought the most important factors of a medical school applicant or residency applicant's CV was for them to invite them to an interview. So you'll see, obviously, unfortunately, Step 1 is the most important thing, but you'll see that your Step 2 CK score is still the 4th highest thing that they look at. And kind of maybe depressing, but they think it's more important than your personal statement. So it's coming in right above your personal statement. So it is very important. It might not be as important as Step 1, but it's going to be very important. And as we move forward, more and more programs are requiring you to have a Step 2 CK score submitted before they rank you. So I know some advice used to be, don't even bother taking it, take it after the application, and no one's ever going to see it. Most programs are going to require you to have a score, so they're going to see it before they make their rank lists. So you can't, unfortunately, really get away from it. Sorry. So I recently went through the ERAS application cycle myself, and so kind of my own take on USMLE exams and why they're particularly so important. So, obviously, your residency application is a combination of several things. You have your personal statements, you have your letters of recommendation, you have all these honors awards, research and publications, and they're all really important, and they all represent you and your ability to become a physician. But I think in reality is these program directors are getting a lot of applications, hundreds, if not thousands for certain specialties, and none of those can be filtered. USMLE scores can. So this is an actual picture of a program director's essentially website of applications. So they got their applications in. You literally can go to this website and click Step 1 or Step 2 CK score and have it filter from highest score to lowest score. And so they literally can just start from the top and move their way down, and once they invite several hundred, then they could just stop. So we really want to make sure that you are not in that bottom portion that's getting filtered out without anyone even reading your application. And so that's when these USMLE scores become really, really important. We really want to make sure that you're not being defined or filtered out by this number. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and toss it off to Mackenzie. She's going to be talking to you about choosing and utilizing resources, creating a study schedule, and then talk about some common pitfalls. Go for it, Mackenzie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mackenzie. As Joel already mentioned, I'm a rising 4th-year medical student at Mount Sinai, and I've been working with Med School Coach for about a year, mostly on Step 2. So I've worked with a lot of students from different backgrounds on Step 2 CK to sort of figure out a good plan and a good, study situation for them. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is choosing and utilizing resources. So, with Step 1, there's so many different resources, and, there's a few things that people are always going to use, mainly First Aid, Pathoma, and UWorld. It's a little bit harder for Step 2 because while we still have UWorld, there's not sort of one main textbook that everyone goes to. Different clerkships have different textbooks. There's sort of a lot of options out there. And because of that, I think students can get a little overwhelmed sometimes. So I think we all pretty much share the opinion that it's better to use fewer resources and to focus on them. And I think almost everyone will agree that UWorld should be the foundation of your studying. And most students take shelf exams throughout third year, and they use UWorld to prepare for those shelf exams. So it's sort of a big advantage when you come around to step 2 studying. If you've done all or even just most or some of UWorld, you've seen a lot of the material that you're going to be using to study for step 2, which is different from step 1 studying, when a lot of students are seeing questions for the first time close to their dedicated study period, if not during the dedicated study period. So another resource that I find really effective and recommend to a lot of the students that I tutor is Anki. And most of you probably know what that is by now, whether you use it or see other people using it. And Anki, people think of it as, a flashcard software. It's really a little bit more than that. It's a spaced repetition algorithm. And basically, it's just a really good way for memorizing facts. And there's a few different ways people use Anki. For step 2 studying, the 2 things I tend to suggest are either making your own cards from UWorld as you go along. So if you're doing a UWorld question and you miss it, you can make a flashcard. And some people don't like to make their own flashcards. So for these students, I recommend taking a pre-made deck. The popular one right now seems to be Zanki. And you can sort of suspend all of the cards in that deck and just unsuspend cards as you want them, right? And so you sort of build a repertoire of cards that you can use to go through and just remember these little minutiae and facts throughout your dedicated period. I think another resource that is often underutilized is the practice tests. So for step 2, there's a few different options. There's the NBME practice exams, there's the UWorld self-assessments, and then there's also the free 120 exam. And I think while students often use practice exams just for a score and as a proxy to see how they're doing, and of course it's valuable for this, I think the real benefit of practice tests is the material, right? So these exams sort of give you a little window in what test makers think are important topics. So you should pay close attention to these topics and learn the material. Treat these questions like UWorld questions and make sure you're giving yourself enough time for that. So I usually tell students to, spend the morning taking a practice test and then don't schedule anything else for that day. So you wouldn't have time to do UWorld blocks or much other reviewing, because you should pretty much spend the majority of the afternoon reviewing the practice test, looking up concepts that were tricky, and really trying to internalize that material because it is really important.
Mackenzie, what do you think about making your own Anki cards?
Yeah, so I think, people have sort of mixed opinions on this, and I think it ultimately comes down to personal preference. I was someone who liked making my own Anki cards. I thought it was useful to phrase information in a way that was very specific to me, and for, to help make sure it was the way that would help me miss or not miss a question that I had just missed. But I know some of the students I tutor are sort of uncomfortable with Anki, and it's a bit of a cumbersome format, and especially if you haven't used it previously, either for step 1 or throughout the third year of medical school. I think it can be a lot easier sometimes to use a pre-made deck, and that doesn't mean you have to do the whole 5,000 card Zanki deck, and you can just pick out the cards that you want to use.
Yeah, I think what you highlight is something very important that I notice across many students, that I think it's great to use Anki cards and flashcards, but I think that there needs to be some sort of active learning role. So either you're making your own cards, so you're identifying important information on your own, or like you said, suspend all the cards, and then the active process of saying, this is important for me versus this is less important for me. I definitely second that.
So as far as creating a study schedule, I know that this is a topic that can cause a lot of stress for students. And with step 1, I feel like students tend to have a relatively similar amount of time, usually somewhere close to 5 or 6 weeks to study. But because of step 2, as Joel mentioned, students have very different amounts of time. And so I think that's one of the things that can make it a little bit difficult to schedule. And I sort of have this formula for success that I think can be definitely modified to students studying over shorter or longer periods of time. And is also a little bit dependent on when the students are taking step 2 relative to their clerkships. But as a general formula, I think you should figure out the number of days you have to study. So this tends to be, the days during a dedicated study period. take out a day for each practice exam, take out a few flex days because things are always going to come up, and then take out a few days for missed questions because it's always nice to have a few days at the end of your study period to do your missed questions. And then this is the number of days you have available. The second part of the equation is figuring out your number of UWorld. And most people reset prior to dedicated. So this ends up being roughly 2,500 questions. You know, some students, if they just finished a clerkship and they're about to start dedicated, they might not want to reset, you know, and redo the questions that they just did the week before for the shelf, which is totally fine. It's very person specific. But then you can essentially take the number of UWorld questions divided by the number of days, and this sort of ends up being your study schedule. So if you go to the next slide, I can sort of give you an example. So if someone has 1 month to study, which I think tends to be the case for a lot of students, you can take these 30 days, subtract 4 days for practice exams, subtract 3 flex days and 3 days for missed questions, which gives you 20 days. So you're like, okay, I have 20 days to work with. If you have 2,500 UWorld questions and you divide this by the 20 days, this ends up being about 125 UWorlds per day. So, you know, everyone sort of has different ways they like to structure their days, but one hypothetical way you could schedule it is in the morning, you could do 40 UWorld questions, review them. In the afternoon, you could do 2 more sets of that. So 40 more questions in review, take a snack, take a walk, 40 more questions in review, maybe have dinner. And then in the evening, you have only 5 questions left and you can review, you can do your Anki, and you should also have some time for subject specific review. And I think, you know, some students might see this and be like, oh, 125 UWorld, that's a lot. That's going to take me all day. Well, the good thing is you have all day. You know, hopefully you're studying during a dedicated period. And the other thing that I think is a little bit tricky to get your mind around, because step 1 and step 2 studying are so different, is that, like I mentioned previously, when students are doing UWorld for step 1, they're seeing every question for the first time. So it takes longer to read each question. They're missing more questions. But for most students that I've worked with, you know, when they're doing UWorld for step 2 studying, they've done a lot of it. You know, maybe on your OB rotation, you didn't have much time to study, so you only did half the questions, right? But you've seen a lot of the material before. So I think, you know, while of course it's, you know, totally personal and some students can get through more questions in a day than other students, do keep that in mind when you're making your schedule, that questions might go a little bit faster than you would anticipate based on your previous studying.
Definitely. And then, like Mackenzie said, it's very important to spend some time during your dedicated study period for Step 2 CK. Because I know some people say, well, I have a month and I'm going to do 2 out of 3 hours a day. And I think in reality, if you're doing a rotation, it's very difficult to be in the hospital all day, come home, and then really put the effort in that is required for Step 2 CK. So try to make sure you have some dedicated study period.
Definitely. And that sort of brings us to some of the common pitfalls in preparing for Step 2 CK. And I think one of the biggest pitfalls is scheduling it for the fall. So I think, you know, there's a lot of demands on a medical student, a rising 4th year medical student's July. Students often have pressure to take Step 2. They have pressure to do a sub-I at their home institution. And in addition to that, and perhaps if they've already done that, they have the pressure to do rotations at other hospitals, so away rotations. And I think students often struggle with this. And I've had peers and students I've tutored who have been like, look, I need to do these away rotations, I'm going to put it off. And the thing is, that doesn't work. You are never going to be as prepared to take Step 2 as you are at the end of your 3rd year of medical school. And it may sound nice to take it later in the fall, but in addition to just sort of the mental weight of having this test hanging over your head while you're doing all these rotations, doing your residency applications, which I think is really tough, it'll often be, you know, resulting in a lower score just because you haven't come straight off the material. So I think, you know, that's the biggest pitfall. And as Joel mentioned, while in the past students who scored really highly on Step 1 were advised to wait on Step 2, that's not really the case anymore. And it's becoming more important, and certain programs, you know, will only interview students who have taken and have gotten a Step 2 score. Other programs, it's less important then, but it comes into, you know, into play for the rank list. So I would say, if at all possible, take it as close to finishing your 3rd year as possible. And there's always things that come up, but just know that the further you push it, the more difficult it's going to be. I think another pitfall is trying new things, and this sort of goes along with, incorporating new resources. In step 2 CK, it is a combination of all the shelf exams. So if you liked your self resources, you can just repeat them, right? Like if you did UWorld throughout the year and you did well on your shelf exams, you can just go ahead and, use UWorld as your primary resource. I think it can be helpful to have, some other resource that you use to look things up. But I think UWorld is very comprehensive. And if you just, focus your time and attention on learning that, you're going to do well on step 2. And sort of going along with that, and I know we have a lot of third years here who this might not be as applicable to, but I think the other thing that can make it difficult is if students have a lack of foundation, right? So you're studying for step 2 CK for all of MS3 year. So the best way to set yourself up to succeed is by giving your 100% to each shelf exam. I know some people think like, oh, I'm not going to be a neurologist. Like, I don't really care how I do on my neurology shelf. But the thing is, your step 2 CK is going to have neurology questions. And even if you're going to be something very remote from a neurologist, you still want to do well in that exam. So I think this is the kind of thing where just, all year you're chugging along and studying, and it really pays off on step 2. That being said, if a certain shelf went poorly, I think that's okay. Even if all the shelves went poorly, it doesn't mean you're going to do poorly on step 2 CK. It just means you need to work a little harder to build that foundation, and it's totally doable. And I think, it's good to just take note of what your weaker subjects are and prioritize this material during step 2 dedicated time. I know it's tempting sometimes to start with easier subjects, but I always encourage students to start with their harder subjects so that they have the most time reviewing them. If you are bad at cardiology and you start reviewing it days 1 and 2 of 30 days, then you're going to have 30 days to kind of let that material seep in. So I think that can be really helpful. And, like most things, you're just sort of chipping away at this, one piece at a time. And if you do that and you put in the time, I really think all students can do well on this exam.
Awesome. Thanks, Mackenzie. That was a lot of pitfalls. Good thing people logged in to watch this. So we're going to go ahead and pass the baton to Dr. Peter White. He's going to cover the same topics and give his opinion and based upon kind of his experience working with the students that he's worked with.
Absolutely. Thank you, Joel. And you'll see that a lot of what I'm going to say is very similar to Mackenzie, because to do well on this test, there's a lot of very similar principles, albeit little nuanced differences. So we'll kind of see what those are. So jumping into setting a schedule, this is by far one of the most important things and one of the easiest pitfalls. I think, Mackenzie, you did a great job of summing up the importance of setting a date. It does vary school to school and how you do it and what specialty you're going into. So the most important thing is that you try and get it over with as soon as possible with that dedicated period of time. And when you do that, what you need to do is set up a schedule. Over here, you can see an example of a schedule that one of my students put together. Basically, what she did was starting from, picking her resources. She decided what I'm going to do. And she, very similar to the way that Mackenzie described that little formula, she literally marked down the number of, questions or the number of pages per book that she had chose and broke it up across each day. So she had a goal of what she was going to get through every day. And from there, she was able to, plow through it each day, giving a motivating factor and give her something to stay accountable, which is one of the easiest things to do to not do when you're going through this stuff. It also allows you to get comprehensive review. When people get involved in picking too many resources, it's very easy to kind of pick and choose a little from here, pick and choose a little from there, and you're eventually going to miss something. So keeping one book, and staying with that through its entirety is going to be very important. Of all things, one of the most important things to doing well, though, is going to be doing well during your third year. And the way you do that is going to be UWorld, 100% UWorld for your clerkships and going through it. And then taking a great, as Mackenzie mentioned, there's no great standard resource for step 2. First aid is the book for step 1. For step 2, there's not really anything. But something that's probably the most comprehensive, albeit it misses some important facts here and there, would be OnlineMedEd. And using something like that as kind of your gold standard, and then taking a book per clerkship is really a great way to start to master the material. And the things that have been shown to be the most predictive of doing well is doing well during your third year clerkships. So preparing well throughout third year is going to really set you apart.
Yeah, quick question for Mackenzie and Dr. White. Have you ever had a student who came to you and you worked with who the problem was too few resources?
No.
Because I have.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
I have not either. I think the most common pitfall is people amass 20 different things and they kind of dabble in each, which Dr. White had mentioned. So it's important to take a few and focus on them.
And I think, Joel, you make a great point there, especially during your third year. That's the time just to kind of experiment with some of your resources. And you got to be willing to adjust to change and figure out what works for you. If you're somebody who Anki works for, start using it at the beginning of your third year. Start using it and kind of get familiar with it. If you're somebody who likes Step Up to Medicine, I'm not one of those people. But if you're one of those people, start using it from the day one of your clerkship. But if you find it doesn't work, you have to be willing to switch. Switch early and switch to what works. So when it gets to actually CK, what you really want to do is pick 1 to 2, board-specific like content resources. Master the Boards is one that people like a lot. USMLE Step 2. Some people like integrating Step Up to Medicine at this point. But the key here is, and we keep kind of beating this down, is making sure to only choose a few resources and making sure to get through them in their entirety. All of these resources, they're not comprehensive, but when you kind of layer on a couple of them together, they start to fill in the gaps, and that's going to be really helpful for you. And if you know that you're somebody who likes reading, or you like bullet points or something like that, something like Step 2 Secrets or Step Up would be more beneficial, or something if you need an actual paragraph explaining it. That's when something like Master the Boards. You need to know what works for you. And like I said, be willing to adjust that when you go through. With regards to QBanks, gold standard, UWorld. You want to start that in your during your third year clerkships. And the ideal way is that you get through it in its entirety. So you've seen all of this material by the time you're getting to your dedicated. So you're using these other resources and these UWorld questions for the second time as almost a form of spaced repetition, where you're just refreshing all of this material, which really should be your goal of your dedicated time. And then when it gets time to assess for really where you're at and to get an idea, for kind of Step 1, the NBMEs are kind of your go-to. People always say, and if you look in the Step 1 literature, there's kind of a 0 to 10 points based on your kind of average of your NBMEs. That's what you can expect. When it comes to Step 2, people tend to find that it correlates a little bit better with the UWorld assessments. So that's something that you should kind of look at and definitely be integrating into your study. So the common clerk pitfalls, most importantly, is not preparing well during third year. A lot of the studies in the medical education literature, when they're looking at board scores, they find that whether it's Step 1 or Step 2, the things that correlate best with performance is earlier onset of preparation. And what that really stands for Step 2 is that's the beginning of the first day of third year. So work through those clerkships. Take that OnlineMedEd and then one specific clerkship resource and get through that material on that clerkship. Take those MBME clerkship specific exams so you get a feel for what the concepts are that they ask, because it's the same question, same question writers and same concepts that show up on CK that are on the clerkships. As we said, not using your resources efficiently, either having too many, or usually, like we said, nobody really does too little, but choosing one that works and not changing when it doesn't work. And one of the things that I find to be one of the biggest issues is using UWorld inappropriately. A lot of people that I've worked with will go through and just do the question for the sake of doing it, which is not it's a very passive way to go about learning the material. In the medical education literature, it's all about active learning and finding ways to make yourself think and get yourself thinking about different, it's called metacognitive processing, where you're actually asking yourself the question why and how, basically why, And by doing that, you really can take UWorld to the next level and really get the most out of it. People get obsessed with focusing on percentiles and how many people got this one question right. Why? Oh, 10% of people got this question right. That's not what it is. UWorld is a textbook. And if you go through that, asking yourselves why, ruling in and out every answer choice, you'll really be able to take your studying to the next level. And that's something that everyone should be integrating into every, UWorld question set that you do, starting from third year.
A quick question to piggyback off that for both Mackenzie and Dr. White. Do either of you have a strategy for note-taking while you're doing UWorld?
I personally don't recommend it. And the reason for that is I find that the majority of the people who are using UWorld in that way, where they're taking too many notes, what they're doing is taking a first aid or a book like that, and they're going off onto tangents, and they're missing the big concept of the question. So focusing in on ruling in out every answer choice, and then just reading all of the answers and just move on to the next one. And if you get it wrong, flag it, come back and see it again, but don't get too overly obsessed with every bit of minutia, because you'll get lost.
I agree with Peter, and I also discourage taking notes. I think students often take a lot of notes and then never end up reading them. But what I do tell students to do, and do it out loud with them if we're tutoring, is ask them to sort of summarize the main point. And if they missed a question, to give me the key fact that they needed to get that question right, that they didn't know, and to formulate that into one phrase so that they have mentally, they've said it out loud, this is the take-home point of this question. And I think having that is really useful, and it's not necessary to take notes.
And just to piggyback on that, I think one of the biggest things that people kind of lack when they're going through their studying is they forget to ask the question why. And that is just so much, all the clinical presentations or physical exam findings that you see are all based on pathophysiology. So if you go back and, remember those principles and ask this question why, you'll start to kind of pick up on those bigger concepts that'll help pull everything together for you.
Awesome. Thank you, Mackenzie and Dr. White. So I'm going to go ahead and just talk a second about kind of what tutoring can offer you and why we find it useful. We have about 26 minutes left, so I'll be quick because I want to make sure we get a chance to get to all these awesome questions that you guys put in. But I think one of the really valuable things that tutoring offers is a one-on-one individualized experience. So the way it would work is you get paired with one of our excellent tutors like Mackenzie or Dr. White, and you would meet with them and they would walk through your entire experience through medical school and essentially use that to help tailor a list of resources for you in a study plan. And they can help you identify what you need. So I think a lot of students come to us and essentially say, I'm not sure what I need, but I know I need to score better. And I think our tutors are really experienced in identifying what they need and then getting that. Sometimes it's content review. Sometimes it's working through questions, and sometimes it's study plan or resource. And so getting you on the right track in the beginning is going to be very important. For these exams, you want to do it right and do it once. So if you want to pass, and if you don't pass with a low score, that's almost worse. So do it right the first time, invest in yourself, it's going to be worth it. Kind of already talked about that. You obviously can Google us if you want more information. We have a website. We have several satisfaction guarantees as well as score increase guarantees. We really stand behind our tutors and tutoring. So let's go ahead and move forward to the question and answer session. So you guys submitted some really awesome questions, and I really want to make sure we get a chance to get to them. I will also comment that I think it's really interesting that there is so much overlap between my experience, Mackenzie's experience, and Dr. White's experience, and I think that really goes to show that there might not be a silver bullet, but there are general habits and strategies that you can utilize to be successful. So webinars like this and really kind of reflecting on your own experience is going to be very important to putting yourself on the right path to doing well. What do you guys think about, I'll give this one to Mackenzie because it's appropriate. What do you think of the timing of the exam? Specifically, if you're doing a gap year, should you take the exam before or after the year?
That's a great question. You should definitely do the exam before the year. My school requires it, which I think is really smart. And I think, when students are taking a gap year, most of the times it's because they have a specific purpose, right? They're doing research, they're getting a master's. And if you have this test weighing over you, say you decide, oh, I need a few months, I'm going to take it in, September or October. I think not only does it weighing on you, it's detracting for whatever you decided to take this year to do. And whether that's, a goal of publishing or just completing a master's degree, that's the focus of the year. So I think it's very wise to study for it, as if, give yourself a deadline, sign up for a test date in the end of July, beginning of August, depending on your schedule, and take it then and make yourself take it then and don't keep pushing it back. Of course, unless, there's unforeseen circumstances. I think that's 100% what you should do.
Yeah, I completely agree. I spent a year as well, and I did want to delay it till later, but I knew that, if you think about, if you did OB-GYN at the beginning of third year, then that's going to be a year since you've seen it. If you wait any longer, it's going to be like a year and a half or 2 years, and so that's a nice way to make it more difficult. Let's see, Peter, have you ever recommended having someone take step 2 before step 1?
I do know that some schools out there allow you to do that. I personally have not. Reason being, the content material is, albeit though it overlaps a lot, there's it's not the same, simply. Step 2 goes a lot more after the clinical side of medicine, which is totally different from the biochemical pathway of some random obscure disease process. So I've never personally recommended that to anyone.
Yeah, I haven't either. Have you, Mackenzie?
No. Mm-mm.
I think there is some value in preparing for step 1 before step 2 CK. There's a lot of overlapping information, and I think that there's value in doing like the basic science and the physiology of step 1 before kind of thinking about the clinical knowledge of step 2. Mackenzie, what is the suspend and unsuspend feature for Zonky?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know Anki is sometimes unfamiliar to people. If you're one of those people, there's like a lot of great YouTube videos, and like the Anki support website can sort of tell you everything. But basically, you can think of suspending as just sort of making something go away, right? So if you're doing an Anki deck and you have a card that's suspended, you're not going to see it. So what I recommend students do is, suspend all of the question or all of the Anki cards. And then say I missed a question on cardiac sarcoidosis. I would type into my Anki cardiac sarcoidosis. I know Zanki has a card on that. And I would see that card and I'd be like, oh, I like this card. This is a fact that would be helpful for me to know. And then I'm going to unsuspend that card. And there's just a button that says suspend, unsuspend. And then that card will be active, right? It's not suspended anymore. So that will show up in my deck. So that when I'm going through and doing my cards every day, I'll see my cardiac sarcoidosis card that I picked out to learn.
You also bring up a good point. I also use Anki, is that there's a search function. So that is kind of a nice way of identifying things quickly. If you put pictures into your Anki, or Anki, or whatever, Anki, then you can search like sarcoidosis, and it pulls up your card, which you have a screenshot of a chest X-ray or something. So it's kind of nice, almost like a searchable note database. I'll also give you this question too, Mackenzie, because you had talked about note cards. But what do you feel about using flashcards from companies like RX? So pre-made flashcards made by other companies.
Yeah, so I think in my experience personally and with students, I think that's fine. I think the key to flashcards is having the spaced repetition. So I know there are a lot of different softwares. There's RX, and then there's all the websites that people use like Memorang. And I think the content can be good. But I think if you have a deck and it has 300 cards and you're just supposed to kind of do it every day, and like some are really easy and some are really hard, and you're not getting to see the ones that you need to see over and over again, you're losing a lot of the value in flashcards. So I've even known students who have, taken cards from other resources or, just sort of made their own and transcribed it so that it's in an Anki format. And I think that's useful. And while it might be a little bit more work, in my own opinion, as a student and a teacher, it's worth it to have that spaced repetition. That really is, the key to memorization.
And we've got a lot of interest on Anki, so I'm just going to give you another one to Mackenzie, which is actually a hard question. The first part of the question is, how many cards would you do per day? One. And then, were the cards specifically factual or conceptual in nature?
Yeah, those are good questions. I think I'll answer the second one first because I think it's a little bit more straightforward. They tend to be factual. So I think, there's a degree of understanding that you need to have. Think about a physiological process. You need to understand why it works. But I think Anki is most helpful for minutia, right? So remembering what is the side effect of a drug, listing the side effect. I think that kind of thing. I tend to prefer Anki cards that are quick, right? I like it to be one question and one answer so that you can do them quickly, and it just tends to be facts. I think for the more conceptual learning, that's where doing UWorlds, and like Peter was saying, really thinking through things and thinking, why is this the answer, sort of comes into play. Of course, having factual knowledge and being able to apply it conceptually are sort of the key to getting questions right. So you need both. As far as how many questions to do per day, I think that's a great question, and it's so variable. And I think different students I work with, tackle totally different numbers of questions or different numbers of flashcards. I think what's actually more important than how many new questions you do per day is how many reviews you do. And the way Anki works is, right, it's spaced repetition. And so Anki knows how many reviews you need to do per day. And so I always tell students under their settings, and again, you can find more information about the settings online, to set their reviews to something like 1,000. Because if you say, I want to do 10 reviews a day, but Anki wants you to do 50 or 100 reviews, you're missing out on a lot of it. But I will say, flashcards are much quicker than questions. And a lot of people can easily do a couple hundred cards a day without it feeling like too much of a burden. But again, it just sort of depends how you want Anki to fit into your study plan as a whole. Some people use it as a small supplement, and I know students who use it for hours and hours a day. So I would say that is a very personal decision. But there's a lot of flexibility, but just make sure you do your reviews. That's the most important.
Now, there's no point in attempting Anki if you're not actually going to do it, especially if you're making your own cards. It's a big investment if you're not going to be committed to do it. And this question will actually flip to the group, and it's the last question we're going to have on flashcards. But have you guys used OnlineMedEd's flashcards? If so, what do you think?
Yeah, I have, and I've also used the Quick Tables book, which I thought to be a very effective means of kind of giving yourself that same spaced repetition. And I think that in my personal opinion, it doesn't really matter which company you go with or what kind of resource you use for that, but you just need to have something in your repertoire where you get that spaced repetition. So being able to integrate that is really helpful. With regards to the OnlineMedEd flashcards specifically, I like them. I thought they were good. They had a good balance and ability to kind of turn on the harder questions, which I found to be really helpful. But I preferred the Quick Tables book overall.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I love OnlineMedEd and relied upon it heavily during my studying. I sort of saw it as a resource for my first round of studying. So I used it for clerkships and didn't really refer to it as much during the dedicated step 2 time. I didn't personally use the flashcards, but I know people who have transcribed them into Anki. And just sort of picked and choose, right? You can say, oh, like I'm really bad at postpartum hemorrhage and remembering the causes. So I'm going to look at OnlineMedEd's flashcards for those and maybe make some of my own or transcribe them into Anki, which I think is totally useful. Personally, I made my own flashcards from OnlineMedEd and just sort of pulled the facts that I thought were relevant or that I needed help remembering. But I think like Peter said, it's really, the material is going to be the same in a lot of these different sources. It's just getting yourself to do it. And like Joel was saying, doing it every day, right? You can't do Anki a day a week. That's not how it works. You won't see most of the benefits.
Awesome. I'll give you this one, Peter. How many resources do you recommend, and how do you pick between different books?
So for CK, I'd usually recommend 2 resources. And that's usually board-specific ones. And I agree with Mackenzie. Something like OnlineMedEd is great for like your first go around, but by the time you get done with your clerkships, you should be kind of layering it on a little bit more at that point. So there's really there are a bunch of resources, but the ones that really people like the most seem to be the Master the Boards and Secrets. So when I work with students, I usually recommend those specifically. However, some people like to get that little extra medicine because half of the CK is internal medicine, like to integrate step up. So it really depends on you and what kind of resources you like, in terms of whether or not it's going to be a question and answer kind of resource like Secrets, or a paragraph literally written out explaining things like Master the Boards. And the most important thing is when you have all these resources, is to pick them and get through them, and don't give up halfway, because then you're not gonna it's not gonna make the most of your dedicated.
Awesome. Then for Mackenzie, I think if I recall, you've used Amboss. Is that correct?
Yeah.
What do you think of Amboss?
Yeah, that's a great question. Amboss is great. For those of you who haven't heard of it, it's a fairly new resource in the US. And they made step 2 material and then more recently step 1 material. It's been around in like Europe for a long time. It's a German company and I think it's excellent. I used Amboss as my secondary question bank for all my shelf exams. And I found it was helpful and enabled me to get sort of some of the higher level, like tricky questions on minutia that didn't come up in UWorld. That being said, I would say UWorld, is still the most widely used and accepted question bank. And I think UWorld should definitely be your go-to. But beyond that, I think Amboss is excellent. And I think I often recommend it for students if they've done all of the psychiatry questions on UWorld. And they're like, man, I still don't feel great about this. Or perhaps more likely it's the biostats questions, right? And they're like, I just need a little bit more practice. And they have Amboss. I'm like, all right, great, totally understand. Do 20 Amboss questions. And Amboss is also great in terms of the explanation, and everything is sort of linked in a library, so you can access information really, really readily. So I think that's really useful.
Would you, and just kind of off the top of my head, but does it make sense, or have you ever recommended using Amboss throughout third year and then using UWorld specifically for step 2 CK, or do you still think that UWorld is very useful for like the shelf exams?
Yeah, that's a good question. I still think UWorld's very useful for shelf exams, and I would be definitely hesitant and a little bit worried or cautious about advising students to use Amboss just because it hasn't been around as long, right? It's not as proven. It might be that Amboss surpasses UWorld someday, but there's just not enough data right now. And I think, if you were just, picking one resource and you only had time for one, which is very understandable, then UWorld should be your go-to. There was a student who had done UWorld 3 times when he came to me for dedicated. And he said, look, I've memorized UWorld. We can't do it during dedicated. I'm going to get them all right because I've memorized it. And I was like, fair, you've done it 3 times. So for that student, for his dedicated period, we did Amboss. And that worked really well for him. We did it in a similar way, a certain number of questions per day from all of the organ systems. But in general, I would recommend students who have not memorized UWorld to start with UWorld and use Amboss as a supplement.
Sure, great. And then Peter, I'll send you this question because you kind of touched on it earlier during your slides. How much time should you spend reviewing each UWorld question, and how important is it to take notes out of UWorld?
So we kind of talked about the taking notes earlier, in terms of if there's one big concept and you want to throw it on like an Anki deck or something like that, that would be something that would be worthwhile. However, you don't want to be that person who gets lost and taking the books out and then start reading up on the whole section, and then all of a sudden, you have a question on thyroid disorders. Next thing you know, you're reading about, parathyroid, and it's just so easy to get into that trap. So usually what I recommend for students, and in terms of just approaching a question, is to start with the question, look at the answers to kind of get an idea of what the question is really asking. Go actually read the question stem, highlighting the important things, and then go to each answer choice and start to rule things in and out based on what they have. And once you get through that, there's the way they set up their answers is they give you the big blurb, which is the big concept for the question, and then they give you the answer choices. So you really just need to get through the blurb once and then read and check your thought process against what they say for the incorrects. If you get it right, you know the concept. Move on. Don't get bogged down with it. If you get it wrong, that means you gotta, spend some time, look at that, and go through that. It shouldn't take you more than, a few minutes to get through a single question.
Great. And do you suggest doing questions by subject or mixed and or timed?
So this is one of those big, everyone's got very strong opinions about this. My personal take is to do it subject-based. And I recommend especially just do it subject-based and tutored. And the reason for that is if you go about the questions kind of in the way that I just laid out, by looking at the answer choices alone, you already know what the question, at least, you can at least figure out the organ system that you're talking about. And from there, you're basically have that knowledge compartmentalized. So people, the big people arguing for doing random questions is, oh, you want to train yourself to think back between different topics. If you already know by looking at the answer choices, who cares, right? So I recommend to go through it, especially when you're dedicated, do it subject-wise. Review cardio one day, then go ahead and do the questions on it. So you're getting that factual laying down of material, and then you're working on using your UWorld to apply that information, which is kind of, that's how you learn it. It's you learn the facts and then you apply it.
What about students who have difficulty with like timing? So when they get to like their practice exams and they're not used to like the timing of questions, what kind of strategy do you then give them?
So that's the only time that I would recommend that they do randomized trials or randomized sets. However, that should never be on their first attempt or first go around through UWorld when they're working on learning the material. When they're getting into that second pass, primarily when they're dedicated, it's okay to integrate a little bit more of those randomized sets to get the timing down, but you'll automatically improve your timing the more that you know, because the questions and the concepts will come back to you faster. So the more that you're able to get that material down, the better you'll be. So a little bit more with timing issues, but overall I still think that subject-wise is the move.
Sure. And then someone's asked about Firecracker for Step 2 CK. I've never even heard of Firecracker for Step 2. I know Firecracker for Step 1. Are either of you familiar with Firecracker for Step 2?
I know that it exists. I haven't had any students or really anyone I've come into contact with use it. I imagine, sort of like we were saying, I'm sure it's got all the facts. I'm sure it has good information. If you are a firecracker because you use it for Step 1 and you want to use it for Step 2, I would say that's fine. It's just another way of learning the material. I'm sure, it's fine, but I can't say personally.
Yeah, I know a couple people who've used it. I didn't use it personally, but I haven't heard any complaints about it, simply. And the whole basis of Firecracker is the same kind of spaced repetition. So if you're getting one of the big concepts from all of us today, that's kind of like, you got to figure out how to integrate that into your study, whether it's Firecracker or Anki or Quick Tables or whatever.
Great. We have a few questions that are asking about specifically international medical graduates and preparing for Step 2 CK. So when you're working with international medical graduates, which we work with a lot, I think almost 30 or 40% of our students are international medical school students or graduates. Do you counsel them any differently? And I'll give this both to Mackenzie and Peter.
No, and there's a caveat to that. It's the same test, right? So in actuality, they should be seeing the same thing on clerkships, and you should still be taking shelf exams. So it's pretty much the same process, same material, same everything. I think one of the kind of, benefits / issues though, is a lot of the schools that are kind of IMG or Caribbean, they give you the option to take extra time. And that's something that can be very, very, very dangerous. And Mackenzie touched on this earlier. It's the same concept of taking it immediately after the third year. You want to knock this thing out, be done, because all of a sudden, ERAS time comes up, you haven't written your personal statement, it opens, you're going to get screened out for getting out applications late. You need to get this thing done as soon as possible. So, the only other thing that I'd add to that is for IMGs, the unfortunate nature of the beast is that Step 2 and Step 1 are probably even a little bit more important than for American medical grads. So you really need to make sure to the stakes are just higher. So you just got to really lay down all the material better, faster.
Yeah, I agree with Peter.
Yeah, awesome. I definitely agree as well. I think that I also want to reiterate what Peter said, and that you can get down a slippery slope of delaying. So you really, again, it kind of gets back to what we said earlier, you really want to do it one time and do it right the first time. So put yourself on the track to do it once and do it right, because you don't want to, get into this, well, I wanted 2 more points, well, I'll delay it a month, and then you're starting to forget all the things you learned in the beginning. And then sometimes we work with students who are kind of in this cycle of delaying a month, and they're either the score is staying the same, or sometimes it even drops because you're just expanding the amount of time, and you get really tired and kind of burnt out on questions and studying. It can be kind of a slippery slope. We have a few questions on books. I know, Peter, you mentioned books in your slide, so I'll put this one towards you. And what do you think about Master the Board for step 3 and First Aid for step 2?
So I know people, I'll start with First Aid. I know people who have liked it. For me, I found that it was just a little too truncated. Each kind of disease process was a little bit too short for me to really be able to pull in the whys and get those concepts and how they integrate together. And for me, I found that Master the Boards for step 2 was much better at doing that, and taking the material from that I had learned from like OnlineMedEd and the pocket notebook for internal medicine, and taking that to the next layer and kind of taking it one step further. So I found Master the Boards to be a little bit of a better resource for that compared to First Aid. I think there are a couple sections in First Aid that are good, but they're not comprehensive enough, at least in my opinion. I can't really speak to Master the Boards for step 3 because I use step 2, but I assume it's pretty much the same. I've heard it's about the same, so I'd imagine it being similar.
I think you made a really great point earlier, which was step 2 secrets. I really like secrets. Maybe it was just the bullet points I found were useful. I think when I found bullet points that I thought were tricky, I could Google or find more information on them, but it was like very quick, got through it pretty quickly, and it was like a very nice comprehensive review and identification of all these important bullet points. Didn't expect to like it as much as I did.
Yeah, I agree. I thought it was a great resource.
So has anyone, or what do you guys think? I'll go ahead and pose the question to both of you. It'll probably be our last question. What do you think of OnlineMedEd's question bank?
Yeah, so I haven't used it extensively. I remember, and Peter, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they tend to be more first order questions. So they tend to be more factual, right? So I think, again, there's always layers of understanding, right? And in order to get that initial layer of understanding and of knowledge that you're going to need to tackle a question, I think you could do that from reading a book, from doing a flashcard, from doing, maybe the OnlineMedEd questions if they're a little bit easier and more factual, and just, in some way arming yourself with the knowledge that you're going to need to tackle the UWorld and NBME questions, which are more conceptual and require a little bit more understanding.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. I also found that I think it's useful to have another set of questions at certain points, because when you get through UWorld, when you get to topics like surgery, there's 120 questions or something like that in there. So that's really not that much. And you can obviously get into some of like the internal medicine GI questions, the little cards, poem, or do the Di Virgilio's or questions, but having some other form that you can kind of go to in situations like that is helpful. When I just remember a couple questions where, they like to have some fun in there, which is good and great, but it can get distracting in some of the answer choices. So I remember getting pulled out a little bit of like the whole thought process. But they test the same concepts. So it's definitely something. I wouldn't use it as a primary resource, but a secondary resource, no problem with.
Great. So that is pretty much, we're out of time. I really want to thank Mackenzie and Dr. White for joining us. And I really want to thank all of our attendees. We had a lot of attendees. We had a lot of really great questions. I know it's a little late, particularly for you for those on the East Coast. So thank you so much for joining us. I wish we can give a round of applause to Mackenzie and Dr. White. We give a digital round of applause. But if you have any more questions about tutoring, you can find more about us on our website. You can also schedule a 15-minute phone call with me if you want to talk about tutoring or talk about if you had questions that we didn't get to. So please check us out. And this will be posted to our YouTube channel. So if you came in late and you want to rewind back to the beginning, you definitely will be able to do that. So Thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful night.
Thanks, guys. Good luck.
Thank you.
Whoop.